So, the purpose of this video. Yesterday, we went over the range DPS. We talked about which of the specs were probably, possibly, perhaps, likely to become stronger in 9.1. We talked about the fall of Fire Mage, the taking over of Arcane and Frost, the possible demise of Affliction for Destruction, and a few other mentions related to which of these specs are going to perhaps change Covenants, pick up new Legendaries, and similar. Now we are going over the melee DPS, which is actually going to be even more diverse. Likely not as many surprises, not as many plot twists in the terms of power, like out of nowhere Enhancement and Feral are now the strongest specs. There is not going to be much of that, unfortunately, but there is going to be quite a few changes when it comes to how the specs are going to play. Why is this video being made? I am making the video just so you can now pretend that you actually know anything about these specs. Just so that the next time you see this argument on Reddit, maybe on Discord, in some other social media site or some forum, and you can just pretend like you actually know what you're talking about. Yeah, man, of course. Of course Red Paladin now is going for Divine Resonance. Yeah, man, Venthyr is no longer viable. Kyrian is just the way to go now. Yeah, man, it was clear. It was clear that Rogue was going to pivot to Venthyr, because Obedience is just too strong now. The purpose is for you to be able to repeat these things, even though you have absolutely no idea about what you have just heard. That's the purpose of the video. So, let's start teaching you how to pretend to know about something. And we're gonna start with Warrior. Just like I prefaced, no, Warrior is not gonna be like Mage, is not going to be like Warlock, is not going to be taking up arms, no pun intended, against Fury and just taking over. Fury is still going to be the stronger spec, Fury is still going to be the playable. I mean, playable is a rough term, arms is still playable, but Fury is going to be the preferred spec for both Mythic Plus and Raiding. But we need to have some numbers, we need to have some comparisons just to drive the point in, just so you can parrot some of these numbers. Arms right now in the first preliminary sims for 9.1 is simply slightly below Fury. By slightly I mean as high as 10 to 15% lower than Fury. So it's not likely going to beat Fury. The main issue for arms isn't just that straight up 1v1 single target versus single target arms is losing, but is the fact that Fury has also excellent sustained DPS when it comes to AoE. Thanks to their Whirlwind and essentially their endless consistent AoE, at least on few targets. We're not talking about 7 or 8 targets. Fury has much higher potential compared to arms. Now, when it comes to arms, in terms of changes, arms are still likely to be playing with Enduring Blow. Signet of Tormented Kings have been sort of the all-rounder for DPS warriors for a long time. In 9.1, Enduring Blow is currently performing the best in Sims, as well as they will continue likely to be playing Nightfall. Ancient Aftershock is very powerful. It has also been, let's just say, fixed to be able to also work with Colossus Smash. So it's now even more powerful than before. The first change, however, when it comes to Warrior is coming in with Fury. Because Fury is one of the first specs we're going to go over that is likely going to be picking up the new shiny Covenant Legendary. A lot of warriors, including Fury warriors, will actually starting to pivot away from Venthyr. Remember, we pointed this out when we went over the power of the specs and whatnot, that more and more warriors were going away from Execute into Condemned, from Venthyr into Ancient Aftershock and Nightfall, because Nightfall was also very powerful when it came to the power of the Soulbinds. However, in 9.1, Sinful Surge is a thing, which is very good for Fury, particularly, to the point that it is the best performing of all of the covenants and combinations with the Soulbinds. You still have the options to stay Nightfall or Ancient Aftershock, which is still very powerful in Mythic Plus, sure, but very likely there's going to be way more Fury warriors focusing or remaining focused on Venthyr to play with Sinful Surge in 9.1. This is our first class we went over and our first possible significant, meaningful change for Fury warriors. Now we move to another class, which is surprisingly actually not very popular, which is Rogue. You would think Rogue is actually super popular and played, but not really. The main change when it comes to Rogue is that we also have some possible Covenant swapping, some very likely Covenant swapping. So the first thing to mention is that, I know, it's still very preliminary, it's still not very certain, but Subtlety Rogue is simming very well. Subtlety Rogue is even going as high as simming higher than Assassination Rogue in single target, which is Pretty impressive, considering we have covered the rise of Assassination Rogue after several buffs to become the strongest, we can say, strongest single target spec in Raid, at least for melee DPS. So the fact that Subtlety Rogue is now even, at least, with Assassination is pretty relevant, is pretty important. Even if you go by 9.0.5 sims, Subtlety Rogue was definitely not on the level of Assassination, and you can see Assassination doing very well there as well. Whereas, not very surprisingly, Outlaw is lagging behind quite significantly when it comes to single target. That's not really a surprise. Outlaw remains pretty powerful in Mythic Plus. It does remain likely the strongest of the specs when it comes to Mythic Plus damage, but as long as we're talking about single target and raid viability, Assassination and Subtlety are both looking pretty nice right now. Now, the particular thing as you read these sims is that both of the specs have their currently stronger legendaries like Doomblade for Assassination, or in multi-target things like Zoldyck Insignia for Assassination, or when you go to Subtlety, Akari's Soul Fragment, or maybe Finality, you can see they are all being overtaken by Obedience. What is Obedience? Obedience is one of the other new Covenant legendaries. So we have Sinful Surge as the Venthyr legendary for Warrior to be released in 9.1, and we have Obedience as the Venthyr legendary for Rogues to be released in 9.1, and it is doing very well right now. The added versatility and the significant reduced cooldown of Flagellation itself, thanks to spendy combo points, is proving to be very powerful, at the very least in single target. Even then, adding versatility is a pretty broad buff. It's not just a buff for single target, it's just a buff to your whole damage. So it is doing very well right now, to the point where it is expected, at the very least it is encouraged, as a possibility that rogues are going to move over to Venthyr come 9.1. Now, this is not really true for Outlaw, however, especially because Outlaw still has his main strongest point when it comes to cleave and AoE, in which case Kyrian and maybe even Necrolord are beating Venthyr. So what's the point if you are an Outlaw to try to go Venthyr just to become 2% stronger in a single target, when you are so much stronger and you can dump so much more power in your AoE strengths? You know, you should just reinforce your current strengths rather than trying to cover for all of your weaknesses. For Outlaw, in this case, it's unlikely that they will be going Venthyr, and they will instead stay Necrolord or go Kyrian. Now we have to go through a list of specs that have not gone through too much change. Number one, we have Demon Hunters. First of all, don't go here. If you value your sanity and if you want to stay away from what is literally a kindergarten, please don't enter this place. Havoc Demon Hunter is not changing too much. Havoc Demon Hunter is still going to be playing Nightfey. Havoc Demon Hunter is still going to go for its main legendaries. It's not going to go for the new Covenant specific legendary. It's unlikely going to switch around too many talents or conduits, so the main part of Havoc is going to stay the same as 9.0.5. What's the problem there? The problem is that 9.0.5 Havoc is not very powerful. It's not very strong. So they are not gaining too much in 9.1. One of the things I mentioned for Havoc is that what they need, generally, is to be bailed out by borrowed powers, because they themselves, as a spec, don't have too much scaling. They are in fact pretty poor when it comes to becoming stronger deeper into the expansion. Because they are a relatively new spec, you might think they are powerful later into the expansion because it happened in Legion and it happened in BFA. However, the reason why it happened is because they were bailed out by Blizzard with borrowed powers, not because they were strong on their own. They were given particularly powerful legendaries in one case and then essences plus corruptions in the other case, which made them much stronger than they normally would have been, which is kind of what's happening here. Not too many changes coming into 9.1, and they will remain a average to mediocre spec in Raid encounters and a stronger and definitely more powerful spec when it comes to Mythic Plus. Another of the specs that have not gotten too many changes are Feral Druid and Enhancement Shaman. Feral Druid is basically staying as it were. It's not going to change Covenant, it is still going to stay Nightfey. This is kind of interesting because we just went over balance and we mentioned that Ravenous Frenzy could have overtaken, Venthyr could have overtaken Nightfey, so you're wondering, well, what about Feral? Do they have the same reasoning as to why they would want to go Venthyr? No. Feral is super bailed out by Convoke the Spirits. Feral lacks a lot of burst, And this expansion, they have been made stronger. Even though they are not popular, as usual, even though they are not very played, as usual, they have gotten significantly better compared to BFA, thanks to the availability of Heavy Burst, thanks to Convoke. So they are totally bound by being able to play Night Fae and stay Night Fae. Same for the Legendaries. They have very good, very variable legendaries they can use for different types of encounters and situations. They have the single target setup with Drought of Deep Focus for more single target damage, and then they have Circle of Life and Death for spread dots in AoE, and then they have the middle, which is Frenzy Band and Apex Predator, which can be sort of flexed how you like them. The similar thing can be said for Enhancement. Enhancement still has... The reason why it's not changing too much, Enhancement Shaman, is because they have very, very powerful legendaries. So they don't get swayed by the offers of the new legendaries in 9.1. Witch Doctor's Wolf Bones with a different build centered around the Feral Spirits, you know, with Elemental Spirits talent is also decent, but the main selling point is Doomwinds. Doomwinds is so strong for Enhancement that it's basically making them ignore whatever change is being brought by the new Covenant legendaries. They are still slightly spread when it comes to the Covenant choice, mostly because they don't have a very particular strong one. They can go for Venthyr, they can go for Night Fae, and now, for something we will talk soon, they can also go Kyrian, which is going to be an option for actually many of the specs. Lastly, the other of the specs that is not changing too much is Windwalker. The reason why Windwalker is not be changing, very similar to Enhancement, is because their legendary is just too strong. Their legendary is Invoker's Delight. They are not going to touch the other Covenant legendaries because this one works too well. And when it comes to Covenant choices, unlike Enhancement, they are still locked in Kyrian. Why? Because Weapons of Order is also too strong. Invoker's Delight works with Invoke Juen, which has a 2-minute cooldown. Weapons of Order is the Kyrian Covenant ability on a 2-minute cooldown, and it just synergizes too well with Juen to use at the same time, and at the same time you also benefit from the legendary. This combo, TLDR, is too strong for Windwalker, so they are not really going to move away from this. Do we have any insight on the possible power? Even though they are not changing or changing slightly, are they actually going to become stronger? There is no indication for this. There is no reason why we could speculate that these specs, already underplayed specs, particularly Enhancement and Feral, are going to suddenly become, out of nowhere, way more played. Same can be said for Windwalker. They have lost a bit of representation in raids ever since they got hotfixed, and they're basically Torment and Fire started doing much less damage, but in Mythic Plus they are still good, they are still fine, they are on a similar level, on a similar note as Havoc Demon Hunter, basically, when it comes to their situation. They have less of a raid spot because you have less melee spots in raid, because Brewmaster and Vengeance are the more popular tanks, which means you don't even get the benefit of being taken simply because you bring a raid debuff in raid encounters, but for Mythic Plus they have more room, they have more window to be taken. Now, going back to the changes, going back to the specs that actually got some changes, you have Survival, which exists as a spec. Survival is likely moving to Kyrian, both for Mythic Plus and for raid encounters. Kyrian is currently the better performing of the specs when it comes to Survival. The same can be said for Retribution Paladin. Retribution Paladin currently is performing best for Kyrian. We have gotten slightly over time a little bit more Red Paladins, not as much as Holy Paladins, but decently enough more Paladins going Venthyr because of Ashen Hallow. You know, the Mega Burst that was allowed with that ability. But in 9.1, you're going to have Divine Resonance, the new Kyrian legendary tied to Divine Toll. This is currently very powerful. It is currently synergizing extremely well with Retribution Paladin and one of the Covenant conduits for Kyrian that they can already use. So it is currently some 7 to 8 to 9% ahead of the other Covenant choices. The same goes for the legendary. Divine Resonance itself is almost 10% stronger than Med Paragon, which was previously one of the more and better legendaries that Red Paladins were using. Same for Final Verdict when it came to pure single target. Now, talking about Kyrian for a second, it's not just Divine Resonance. It's not just this. There are quite a few specs. We mentioned Red. Enhancement could do the same soon. We will talk about Frost Decay. We mentioned Rogues being able to go Kyrian as well. The reasoning for this is this fat fuck. Mikanikos. Mikanikos has just gotten mega buffed in 9.1. Bronze Call to Action, his ability, his main cornerstone ability has gotten significantly buffed. It's going to take much less time to prop him up. 75 actions, 75 instances instead of 90, and way more instances of actions, of abilities, and dots and ticks and buffs are going to count to stack up Brawn, to the point that now it takes you almost 3 times less time to actually proc Brawn. So currently Mikanikos is doing very well as a soulbind. You can see Mikanikos sort of as the start of the expansion, how Pelagos was at the start, how Nia was at the start, you know, this type of soulbinds that were powerful enough that made you go for that Covenant, even if maybe the Covenant ability, for example, wasn't as powerful, simply because the soulbind itself was very good. In the case of Ret, Paladin is a standalone, is a special example because they also have a very powerful legendary. So you couple the very powerful legendary for Kyrian plus Mikanikos, and the numbers are very big in the favor of this combo. But there are quite a few other specs, like the one we are going over now, which is Death Knight, Frost Death Knight, which can go Kyrian purely because of Mikanikos. Kyrian DK doesn't really get much from their new legendaries. Unholy is basically not changing anything. Unholy is still staying Necrolord. Unholy is still keeping its normal legendaries it's been using for a while. The main difference is Frost. Frost still has quite the array of options when it comes to legendaries. Rage of the Frozen Champion, Biting Cold, and Cold Tira's Favor, if they're going for single target or if they're going for AoE and Mythic Plus, etc, etc. They are still very likely going for the dual wield Obliteration build, and for that setup, Kyrian, especially, of course, Mikanikos Kyrian, is the best option. It's not likely that we're going to be seeing as many Frost DKs rerolling Kyrian, simply because Kyrian has something like 1% representation in Death Knights. Kyrian is pretty poor. The Covenant ability has been pretty poor for a long time, so not many DKs are going to go Kyrian, and considering that even with this, Necrolord is still very good for DK, it's not going to be as likely to convince so many DKs, so many Frost DKs to take a leap of faith and just jump into Kyrian, especially when they can simply stay Necrolord, and both Blood and Unholy can do just fine with Necrolord, so they would also have a much easier time respecking and rerolling within their class without getting screwed because they tried to go Kyrian just for Frost. So at the end of the day, when we go over all of the melee DPS, this is where we are stopping, this is where we are right now. Present time, 9.0.5. We have had the Assassination Rogue rising through the ranks, specifically thanks to their single target. We have gotten the overtime scaling of Frost Death Knight becoming pretty good. At this moment they are doing more damage than Unholy, but it doesn't mean as much. Unholy is likely going to remain the preferred spec for raid encounters, particularly because of the edge they have over Frost DK thanks to their Execute ability, that being Soul Reaper, of course. For the most part, I don't think there is going to be too much change. I still think Fury is going to outperform Arms. I don't think there is much of any change that we're going to see when it comes to Feral, when it comes to Survival, when it comes to Enhancement, at the very least, you know, in terms of the representation. Same can be said, we went over this already, for Windwalker and for Havoc. I don't think too much is going to shake up in there. The main thing I'm interested about, and I would like to see, once the raid opens and we start getting the first logs and the first progression numbers, how Subtlety Rogue is going to do, because at the very least on paper, right now they are doing pretty well, as well as the Red Paladin change with a pretty powerful legendary buff they are receiving in 9.1 to see how it's going to change. Now, more so than range DPS, I haven't mentioned this as much when it came to range, but more so than them, melee are hinging a little bit more in the Mikanikos change for Kyrian. So it's also going to be very relevant to see if in the first week of the patch, and maybe even the first week of the raid being open, if we are going to get any further tuning related to Mikanikos, because it does seem like it's a little bit over the top right now. So after this disclaimer, we can stop. Thank you guys for watching the video. If you want to support the channel, leave a subscribe. Otherwise, do what you want, okay? I'm not judging. See you guys soon. And in the meantime, the heat is back. We are now at 34 degrees. It's not good. I seek help.